Welcome back. We're following breaking news at this hour. Just about an hour ago, we learned a possible signal has been picked up in the search for Flight 370. Another one. It still needs to be studied, further analysis. But the Australians are working on that as we speak. Also, just coming in, we now know who in the cockpit spoke those final words heard from the plane. We're live with the very latest on all of these fronts covering the search. Let's go first to Aaron McLaughlin, live in Perth, Australia, the heart of the search effort. Aaron?
Hi, Kate. That's right. We're hearing from Australian officials that one of their sonar buoys near the vessel, the Ocean Shield, has picked up on a signal that may or may not be a ping. Needs to be analyzed overnight, but they're saying it is looking promising. And that is significant because it could mean that the black box batteries have yet to expire. It could also mean that give them more information with which to narrow down a potential search field. And they need that additional information in order to be able to deploy that underwater autonomous vehicle to have an easier time in searching for potential wreckage. Now, these buoys are pretty interesting. The P3 surveillance planes, the Australia RAF planes have been dropping them on the water by the dozens, and they're equipped with hydrophones that then go about 1,000 feet underneath the ocean's surface to detect any signals. Those signals are then sent back up to the plane to be analyzed. It's really interesting technology. Just one more example of how science is contributing to this search. Kate?
Science and an unusually and unprecedented international cooperative effort, and we will keep watching it, and hopefully they get more findings and they get them soon. Let's bring in Nick Robertson live from Kuala Lumpur with news about what was going on in the cockpit. We have new information. Nick, what is it?
We now know, Chris, that it was the pilot who was the last one to speak to air traffic controllers, who said "Good night, Malaysian 370." That has been a very key question to find out who was the last person speaking from the flight deck of that aircraft. We now know as well that 5 MAS, Malaysian Airlines pilots, have been played the recordings between the cockpit and the air traffic controllers. All these 5 pilots were told are familiar with the pilot and the co-pilot aboard that night. They have reported now clearly that it was the pilot's voice they could hear. We're also told there was no third voice in the cockpit, that there was no sound of disturbance, that nothing was out of the ordinary, that there was no sound of distress coming from the cockpit. 2 sources here, senior Malaysian government official and another source involved in the investigation, both telling us this very important detail for investigators, Chris.
An important detail. Nick Robertson, thank you very much for bringing it to us. Let's get some more perspective on why it's so important and these other big developments and what it means for the overall progress here. We have David Susi, a member of the New Day family and CNN family for sure now, as a safety analyst and the author of Why Planes Crash. He's a former FAA inspector. And Ms. Mary Schiavo, CNN aviation analyst, former inspector general of the Department of Transportation, also an attorney who represents victims and families after airplane disasters, and I believe the creator of pasteurization, if I'm not mistaken. Is that true also, Mary? So tell me, why, Mary, because you have this pedigree, why do I care that it was the pilot whose voice was heard in the cockpit? What does this do for me?
Well, it gives us a couple clues. First of all, we know that at least at that point, the pilot was still alive, still able to communicate, still able to function. And, of course, the other thing that we wish we knew is who did all the other communications. An important piece of evidence was surely the investigators know, because they've now played these recordings for other pilots, which is pretty standard. That's what you do in an investigation. We would like to know who made all the other communications, and if there was a handoff, if the co-pilot or the pilot not flying was communicating, and then it switched and the pilot was communicating. That tells us something too. That tells us that perhaps the control of the aircraft was handed to the other pilot, or, since we have to guess at this, maybe the other pilot wasn't there or wasn't capable of functioning. That would be a simple guess, but usually it's the pilot not flying that handles the communications.
So we know it was the pilot. We don't know what else was going on. We won't know until we get the black box. We still may not know because it only records 2 hours. And so far, to your knowledge, Mary, has there been anything deduced or revealed in the investigation with who he knew or where he was living online that would suggest anything to implicate the pilot or co-pilot in anything nefarious?
No, not a thing. And our own FBI reviewed the computer and flight simulator data, and you would expect to find something if you were hatching a nefarious plot. Even online research. Of course, you could always go to a library, but if, for example, there are lots of theories like they climbed 45,000 feet to depressurize a plane and kill the passengers, something like that on the internet or in searches, nothing, not one thing. Which,
and it's important.
Certainly would suggest,
that's
that they haven't planned
important.
anything.
And I keep bringing it up because you have to have something before you damn these gentlemen and their families by implication. Now, something that is relevant in piecing it together is the path that this plane took. We've been cobbling pieces of information together. Let's get back to Nick Robertson because we believe we may have another nugget that helps us understand this. Nick, what else do you have?
Chris, this again coming from two sources, one a senior Malaysian government official, another one a member of the investigation team. We're told now that it is believed that the aircraft dipped significantly in altitude to around 4,000 to 5,000 feet, dipped from the cruising altitude of about 35,000 feet down to about 4,000 to 5,000 feet, flying for about 120, 125 nautical miles at that height before coming up again to cruising altitude. Why do these sources say that they believe that they have this information? They believe that it's based on, or they say it's based on radar data that the Malaysian military radar detected at a certain point as the aircraft, as we know, it flew towards Beijing, came back across the Malaysian peninsula, flew out into the Malacca Straits. In the Malacca Straits there, it disappears from the Malaysian military radar. It disappears and then reappears further on. And from all the data, these experts are telling us they believe that the aircraft therefore dropped in altitude to about 4,000 to 5,000 feet before coming back up, before flying off around the north of Indonesia, out into the southern Indian Ocean. We also have another piece of information here, perhaps more relevant to how authorities were responding at the time. We've heard a lot of discussion, why didn't the Malaysian military scramble jets when they realized an aircraft had flown across their airspace? What we are now being told is that the Malaysian military did scramble their jets after they heard, after it had been reported to them by Malaysian Airlines that the aircraft had gone missing, scrambled jets, flew them off the west of Malaysia into the Malacca Straits. Before that, they could confirm that the aircraft had gone that way, but in case, taking a step, in case the aircraft had gone that way, to find out what they could find out. They were way behind it. They didn't get any additional information. But this is the first time we're learning now that the Malaysian Air Force did respond that morning, scrambling fighter jets to search for MH370.
All right, two quick points of clarification. The first one is, Nick, where do they think it dropped altitude again?
Off the west coast of the Malaysian peninsula, a place called Perak, close to a place called Perak Island. It reappears about 250 nautical miles northwest of Penang Island. Okay. The distance between those 2 points is about 120 nautical miles.
That's when it happened. The second thing is, it's a little confusing. You're saying that the Malaysian authorities say they did scramble their fighters based on this, and yet early in the investigation, am I wrong? Am I misremembering that they didn't seem to have any information about where the plane could be? But how could they have not had any information if they had scrambled jets in that direction?
Well, this is correct. There was a lot of early indications from both the Malaysian Air Force and the civil aviation that have subsequently been contradicted. What we now know from the Malaysian, from people close to the investigation now, is that those jets were scrambled around about 8 a.m. in the morning, remembering that about 7:30 a.m. that Saturday morning, Malaysian Airlines had told the military that the plane had gone missing. Now, it isn't until later that the Malaysian military, as a matter of deduction, basically they take their radar, remove from it all the aircraft that have known identifications, and therefore they can identify the track that was the radar track of the missing MH370. This is how they did it, but that was later. Right. They scrambled the jets as a precautionary measure, but they didn't tell the authorities, I have to add this, but they didn't tell the authorities for another couple of days until the Tuesday after the Saturday. Hence we get into this area where one part of the government saying one thing, another saying the other, Chris.
Confusing, Nick. Hey, but you know what? Also, very helpful. Thank you for bringing us the information. You get more, get back to the control room so we can come back to you. Appreciate it. All right, help me understand what's going on here. First part, David Gallo, good to have you. You were pivotal in finding Flight 447. You understand the dynamics here, so we'll bring you in on the discussion. David, I haven't spoken to you yet this morning. If the plane dipped in altitude, which is something you and Mary have been asking a lot about, we need to know altitude, we need to know altitude. If it did it in that point of the flight, tell us where was that and what sense you make of a dip in altitude at that point?
Well, it seems
because it's too soon to be out of gas.
It is. So it seems to me close enough to the turn that it would have had something to do. It would indicate to me that there was some kind of rapid decompression on the aircraft. Because the first thing you want to do is you're going to hit your flight change or the flight level change button, and it's going to go to the pre-defined altitude, whatever you set that altitude at.
Rapid decompression meaning an accident, something beyond the control of the pilots as opposed to an intent.
Correct.
All right. Do you agree with that?
Sure. I mean,
Why?
that's not my zone of expertise, but yeah, I mean, it just sounds like that kind of rapid motion like that, something that severe would be just what David said.
Mary Scavo, you're nodding your head in the affirmative position. Why?
I do agree with it. Well, because also a drop in altitude to 4,000 to 5,000 feet is not low enough to evade radar. So the decrease in altitude is not any stealthy thing, but it's probably a life-saving thing because you can't evade radar at 4,000 or 5,000 feet.
Life-saving or what else?
Well, they said that it did go off radar, though, Mary. They said that it dropped to 5,000 feet. That's how they know it was that low, is because that's the bottom of the radar scope. So they said that that's, at least if I'm hearing that right, that it was off radar for 120 miles, then it came back on radar.
Right. But you don't think it was intentional to evade?
I don't think so, because if it was, it would have stayed there.
Right, and it wouldn't have, right, and they would have needed to be low. There was that outer range that they were dealing with also with radar. That part gets confusing. Another part gets confusing. I don't get this. Mary, let me come back to you on this. If you scramble jets, scramble to me suggests sending them in a direction. If you scramble them, which means sending them in a direction, that means you have a direction to send them in. How could the Malaysian authorities say early on, we don't know where the plane is, if you knew enough to scramble jets in a direction?
Well, I'm thinking that the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing.
For 2 days?
You know, we had some of the same kind of, that very amazing to me. Or they just simply didn't want to say that they had scrambled jets. But, you know, scrambling them, there's no point in doing it if you don't know where to send them. I suppose you could just go up and look around, but that makes no sense. So I just, one of the stories has to be erroneous.
So, David Gallo, you know, let's put some common sense on this as someone who's been through it. This isn't about Malaysia and whether they're, you know, up to date and how they govern or not. It's just, you certainly don't want to not know where your plane is, right? That's the last thing you want as the sovereign involved, as the authority involved. And that's exactly where they were.
Absolutely.
So you would think if you had any information about where the plane may be, you would immediately offer it up just so you don't look stupid.
Absolutely. The last thing you want to do is lose a plane in the ocean without knowing almost exactly where that plane was when it was last under the sun. Because once you get beneath the sea, as we're finding out, it's a whole different ball game.
So best guess is here, military had some indication that something just flew over your airspace. It's at a weird height. We don't like that. Let's do what we always do in these situations, which is go out after it and see what it is. They couldn't find it. And then they just didn't communicate that until the story about the plane came out a couple of days later?
And what's really strange about that for me is he said that they dispatched and they scrambled them and they went over towards Malacca Straits. Well, I thought they didn't know that it went that way at all. They supposedly didn't get this radar information until much later, and now we're just getting information about that radar still. So how?
Although they were cagey about their first acknowledgement that we think it made a left. Remember, they thought they made a left, and we didn't know why they thought. Maybe this is why they thought it made the left, and they just didn't want to say it for one of two reasons. What are the two reasons you don't say it? One is you don't want to give up what happened, and two is you don't want to be caught so late that you should have known so much earlier when you have these families desperate for information.
Because those air traffic control centers, they were debating back and forth for hours and hours before they finally said, "Oh yeah, it really is missing. We need to do something." And as he said, now we're behind the game. Now they notify Malaysia. They dispatch the jets, say we think it went this way, and now you're behind it. Now you don't know where it is.
So most important, when this information hits the atmosphere, it's going to be, ooh, it dropped in altitude. You know what that means? This was a hijacking. None of you believe that it is evidence of a hijacking. In testing the data, it speaks to an accident as much as it speaks to anything else because it doesn't serve a clear purpose if it was done on purpose. Mary Scavo, did I get that at least half right?
Right. Well, I believe that without some evidence of a motive or some evidence of a crime, yeah, there's a mechanical explanation just as easily as something nefarious.
And at this point, David Gallo, even with a 2-day lag between military speaking to representative government in Malaysia, you would know if this pilot or co-pilot was having conversations with somebody.
Sure, I mean, you would think so in this day and age,
you would know if they were connected to a group. You would know it was on the hard drive of his simulator. You would know it was on his computer. You would know.
You should know.
You should know.
Yeah.
Right? A month in, somebody would know if there was a reason to connect them. Why am I saying this, David? I'm saying it because isn't this more justification to go slow before blaming the pilots?
Absolutely. In fact, again, every day we get more and more and more to do with the what happened. We have no idea why it happened. And that's the hard part. That's what we're going to have to try to dig for.
Nick Robertson is telling the control room that he is being told the reason it dipped to that altitude was to avoid other commercial traffic. How would they know that? Who has an answer? How would they know that that's why it dipped if they didn't get any more communication from the cockpit?
Because there's no commercial traffic down at that level. Commercial traffic is at higher levels. They just deduct it.
That's an assumption.
That's an assumption.
Because that could go for 5,000 feet. It could go for 8,000 feet. Sure. Right? Because there's a minimum flight ceiling.
Anything below 18,000 feet, he's out of the commercial airways.
So from 18,000 feet down, that could be an explanation, but they don't have any information to drive knowledge.
But that is a good assumption, in my opinion. I mean, it's a great assumption, because if you have no navigation, you don't know what's going on, you can't communicate with anybody around. It's like being on the highway, driving down the highway. Everybody else has lights, but you don't. And you're trying to navigate your way through. You're going to hit.
And because it is a significant navigational route, I'm being told, towards Asia, it is making sense that you would want to get out of the way of other planes if you were in trouble. What still doesn't make sense, though, is if you were in trouble. I understand. I forget what the acronym was, but it's you navigate and you whatever it is. There's two things you do before you communicate.
Yeah.
But for this length of time, over 100 miles, you navigate, you aviate, and then you communicate. Wouldn't they have said something if they were in control of what was going on?
Particularly if it's going to go back up to that altitude again. Would you go underneath the traffic route and then come back up again?
Or at least saying, I got to get out of the way of traffic.
Right, or unless it was disabled, unless maybe they lost the capability.
Right. Yeah.
And that's also a possibility. It's still possible that you could lose capabilities as opposed to turning them off.
That's right.
Mary Scalvo, anything to add before we go?
No, I agree. I mean, there's many accidents where, fires or decompression, et cetera, took out the communications abilities. So we're left, squarely between two camps again.
All right, but at least new information to go off of, new data, picture coming together. Mary, David, thank you very much. Kate.
All right, we clearly have a lot of big developments breaking right now in the search for Flight 370. We'll have much more on the search and the news when we come back.